Do you back these drone strikes that have killed British citizens fighting for Islamic State in Syria? Maybe you've been pondering the question following the news just emerged that an unmanned RAF aircraft, a drone, launched a fatal attack on two people, 21-year-old Rayad Khan and 26-year-old Ruhul Amin, in Raqqa in August. They were originally from Cardiff and Aberdeen. The government said the drone strike was a legal, lawful act of self-defence because the men were terrorists who were planning a series of atrocities in the UK. But you'll remember that MPs specifically rejected military action in Syria 2 years ago. So what's going on? Ministers are now facing calls to publish the legal advice they received on this latest operation. However, the Defence Secretary, as we heard, said if he had to, he'd do it again. Just to assess the situation as it stands, here is our reporter Tim Johns.
It was August 2013 when the government wanted to use airstrikes against President Assad's forces in Syria. A vote was held in Parliament, the sovereign body, the heart of our democracy. Our MPs said no to military action in Syria.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
Everyone was on the same page.
We're going to listen to the country and make sure that Britain is not involved in any military action.
The Chancellor, George Osborne, said that because Parliament had quite simply said no.
That's the kind of government we want to be.
And along we went, safe in the knowledge that there would be no UK military involvement in Syria. Until yesterday afternoon, out of the blue, came this.
In an act of self-defence and after meticulous planning, Rayad Khan was killed in a precision airstrike carried out on the 21st of August by an RAF remotely piloted aircraft while he was travelling in a vehicle in the area of Raqqa in Syria.
Well, that's funny because
precision airstrike
sounds a bit
RAF remotely piloted aircraft
like UK military involvement in Syria.
In the area of Raqqa in Syria.
Journalists went into immediate overdrive at the news.
Today at 5, Britain carries out its first drone attack in Syria, killing 3 Islamic State fighters, including 2 British men.
It's big news because targeted assassinations using drones owned by the British military to kill British nationals in Syria, where Parliament voted not to use British military to kill anyone, is, well, big news. So, when is a parliamentary vote against military action actually a vote for military action? David Cameron did outline compelling reasons why this was necessary.
Both Junaid Hussain and Rayad Khan were British nationals based in Syria who were involved in actively recruiting ISIL sympathisers and seeking to orchestrate specific and barbaric attacks against the West, including directing a number of planned terrorist attacks right here in Britain, such as plots to attack high-profile public commemorations, including those taking place this summer.
When the government tells us about such compelling intelligence, surely we have to act. There was an imminent threat. David Cameron had no choice. Reminds me of someone else.
We will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk.
Some critics of this drone strike are sceptical whenever the government bases any military action on intelligence, which they only share with the public in part. And they do have their reasons.
He has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
This morning, the Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon, said this about Syria.
At some point, I think the new Parliament will have to rethink the absurdity of us not being able to strike.
Well, we sort of just did, Mr. Fallon. But if the intelligence was right, the drone strike was within the law and it might have saved lives, perhaps Parliament will accept it.
Our reporter Tim Johns there. On Twitter, @TimOnCheese. Do you worry when you hear about intelligence that suggested the men who were killed were planning to attack VE Day commemorations at a ceremony on Armed Forces Day? Do you smell a rat there? Maybe it recalls that warning before the Iraq War that Saddam Hussein could deploy weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes. Do you back secret drone strikes against British citizens fighting with Islamic State in Syria? Let's hear from John Rees, socialist author, one of the founders of the campaign group Stop the War, and also at Westminster for us is Colonel Bob Stewart, Conservative MP. I'll start with you, Colonel Bob. You believe this was the right action?
The Prime Minister has an absolute duty to take action to defend our people when there's a threat. These 2 men were in Syria. They were British nationals fighting with the enemy of our state and intent on doing us harm. I don't know what the intelligence was as to what they were going to do, but frankly, in this sort of instance, the Prime Minister's absolutely right to take action immediately and with deadly effect.
OK, John Rees, let's just park the idea that they were trying to kill the Queen. We'll come to that in a second. If you are in Syria and you have a photograph taken of yourself in battle dress with a gun, you're a target. Isn't that right?
Well, you certainly are a target in terms of the war that's going on in Syria.
Right, so why not strike them?
Well, the trouble is the Parliament voted not to take part in that conflict, and it was right to do so. The government is now, of course, using this as a way to try and ramp up the vote in Parliament, which it intends to take place this autumn, to return to war in Syria. But 2 years ago, our representatives decided that this wasn't going to happen. Just as well they did, by the way, because then we were talking about an attack on President Assad's regime, which would have assisted the rise of the Islamic State. So one of the things that those of us that were opposed to that military intervention did was to avoid yet another catastrophic foreign policy mistake.
So your argument against this, John, is that Parliament voted against military action, and this is military action?
Of course it's military action.
Bob?
Everybody understands it's military action.
Come in on that, Bob Stewart.
Well, we've done this before. We've done it in Afghanistan. We've done it indeed in Pakistan. Frankly, the remotely piloted airborne systems used by the RAF, the Reapers, are so stunningly accurate now that very few civilian casualties are caused. For example, in 2013, everyone thinks lots of civilians were killed by American, British Reapers in Pakistan. You know, some people said 500, some more than that. Actually, the truth is there was one unconfirmed kill and possibly 3 others.
But it's still military action. It's the military action Parliament voted against. That's the point.
Personally, I agree that you could argue that. I'm sorry, but I think the Prime Minister has a duty to take action to defend us just simply because we are under threat. And these 2 people, whatever some guys in this country say, we're actually in the uniform of our enemy, and we are actually taking action against the Islamic State or Daesh terrorists in Iraq. And my goodness, I think it's totally artificial to say that we shouldn't do so in Syria.
Let us leave the Parliament vote. I take your point on that, John Rees, but it's entirely morally justified, is it not, to kill them?
Well, the problem is that has to be decided by Parliament. If it's decided...
Well, let's say it's not. Let's leave that for a second. Is it justified for the Prime Minister, if he gets intelligence on a particular day, to send a drone up and kill them?
No, because what he's doing is 2 things. First of all, he's committing a political mistake. For every terrorist you kill illegally by invading some other country's sovereign airspace without a vote in Parliament, I'll tell you what it does. It kills 1 terrorist and recruits another 100.
Yeah, but they're British. They're not Syrian.
It doesn't really matter to Daesh who they recruit them from. What's going to happen is that the Daesh recruiters, the IS recruiters, even now are on the internet saying these people say they abide by the rule of law. These people say that they abide by parliamentary democracy. Look what hypocrites they are. Look what liars they are. So everyone you kill, you've recruited another 100 to have to deal with. And that's a counterproductive policy if there ever was one.
Bob Stewart, on the justification, with two things. One of them is that, as you say, they appear in a newspaper wearing a silly uniform and holding a gun. They're a target. But secondly, we now have this odd explanation that they were planning to kill the Queen. Now, you, I'm guessing, smell a rat there, because we have no details on that whatsoever.
I don't smell any rats, Jeremy. I accept that our Prime Minister has to act in the interests of all of us when there is something that is such a clear threat. These people...
So you believe Tony Blair as well, did you?
What? I'm sorry, what are you talking about?
Well, he on that basis, you believed that Tony Blair was right when he said Iraq had 45 minutes to strike with weapons of mass destruction. You took it at face value.
I didn't take that bit, but I certainly took the fact that there were chemical weapons there. If there weren't, how come the Kurds were gassed and so were the Marsh Arabs?
Well, that was 20, 30 years ago.
I know, but there were them then.
But it was wrong. That was my point was you were told things...
It's wrong.
So this could be wrong as well.
I was in favour of it.
This could be wrong as well.
It could be wrong. I agree.
Right.
But frankly, the Prime Minister doesn't have the luxury of hindsight. He has to do what he can, where he can, to protect our people. And frankly, thank goodness we have got a Prime Minister that does take that decision. We might not have.
But Bob, you're an MP.
Who are you?
I'm John Rees from Stop the War Coalition.
Okay.
I'm very good to talk to you again. But Bob, you're an MP. Surely your elementary duty should be now to stand up in the House of Commons and say to the Prime Minister, you have told us that we had to take these people's lives immediately because they were a threat to the Queen on VJ Day and to Armed Forces Day.
I don't think he said that.
Yes, he did. Those are the reports in the newspapers today.
There were reports in the newspaper. I was in Parliament. They didn't say that.
It wasn't that specific.
And those are briefings coming from, as you know, the security service. How come if the threat was on those days in May and June, these people weren't killed until August? The clear fact of the matter is that those plots, if they existed, were foiled by other means, and they are now being used as an excuse post facto to kill people 2 months later. You at least should be standing up and doing your duty as an MP and questioning the Prime Minister on these matters. You can't surrender your critical thought just because you've been told something by the security services.